Lord of mercy. I'm a little late because I got lost. I went the wrong direction coming out of the hotel because I got in there late last night. So anyway, that means you can't trust anything I'm about to say, because anybody who gets lost when he loses the opportunity to hear the nice things that were said about me. Can't be trusted. As you know, Professor Andrew Lau was unable to attend this conference, and I'm his last-minute replacement. By the way, I know this conference is extremely serious because my soul brother, James, when I saw him in a tie, which is the first time I've ever seen him in a tie, I knew that this was serious business. And 2 days in a row, and that's really saying something. Anyway, with all due respect to his replacement, which doesn't require too much effort, there is really no replacing a scholar and theologian of the caliber of Dr. Lau. Having spent the greater part of the past 10 years studying patristics in Oxford myself and in London, I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Lau speak on a number of occasions, and even shared a panel with him once. And I can personally attest to his extraordinary command of the themes of patristic theology and the patristic phronema, or characteristic mind of the fathers, as well as his commitment to understanding and realizing these themes in a higher spiritual sense that transcends the usual historical critical analysis of things. There are at least 3 books of Dr. Lau's that are constant companions of mine, including his early Discerning the Mystery, with its groundbreaking chapter on the recovery of allegory and allegoresis in the Fathers, in the patristic exegesis of Scripture, his excellent study of Dionysius the Areopagite in the Outstanding Christian Thinkers series, and of course his more recent translation of some of the most important texts of St. Maximus the Confessor, with an extensive introduction, which is, in my opinion, probably the single best introduction to St. Maximus in English. In other words, I'm feeling sort of like a high school saxophone player who learned a few Charlie Parker tunes and is at a conference and he's just heard that the great man is going to be here and he has to go up and perform. So I must rely heavily on your goodwill and your generosity, and I hope to use your kindly forbearance as a goad to pray that the grace of God will carry us past God willing, beyond whatever intellectual energy I might be able to bring to bear on our subject. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Whoops, have I just upset the ecological balance of everything? The ecumenical balance of everything, but I can still say, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. I think that's a perfectly Christian thing to say. This conference seeks to open a dialogue between 2 paths of the heart, Sufism and the Hesychasm of the Christian East. But a dialogue that does not involve both parties at the fullness of their being is not worth the time that we spend on it. Islam and Christianity, as has often been pointed out, have much in common. But we must also admit honestly that they are, or seem to be, sharply divided as regards a single core belief of fundamental importance, namely the unity and unicity of the divine nature, upon which hang the acceptance or rejection of the Trinity, Jesus Christ as the incarnate Logos or as a prophet, and Muhammad as either the seal of prophecy or a deluded heretic, or even, as I have heard, the forerunner of Antichrist. These are stumbling blocks of the most serious nature, which cannot be wished away with any kind of verbal sleight of hand. It is important in a conference like this to bear in mind that nothing we say or do here will change either the nature of Christianity or Islam. The best we can hope for is a change in ourselves, in our own understanding, and if not in our own nature, then at least in the mode of existence, which is a characteristic term of St. Maximus, the tropos hyparxeos of our own being. Now, I stand here as an Orthodox Christian because of the work of 4 men, only one of which was Orthodox. The first was a strange alchemist. There's probably one person in this room who knows to whom I am speaking, who hit my life like a thunderbolt and gave me the gift of realizing that God was real, was really real. And then he was gone. Then the next person was a Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, whose writings I found absolutely providential. And following them from his early move into the Trappist order all the way back to his own struggles with trying to discover what happened to Trappist spirituality in 1,000 years, led him back to the foundations of that spirituality, and which ultimately led to St. Benedict, St. John Cassian, the Desert Fathers, and the tradition of Hesychia, from which we are going to speak. And that was absolutely invaluable. And thirdly, and perhaps most important, was a Sufi, Frithjof Schuon, whose writings came to me in a moment, in a time of absolute doubt and confusion in my life, and who seemed to reach out through his books and through his difficult prose, reach out and literally, like a lightning bolt, make ideas of religion and of spirituality and of doctrine and theology come alive, strike fire in a way that was incredible, just incredible. So, and then there's finally a monk who is really a hermit, living in Northern California right now and not really seeing or talking to anybody. That's how I got here, essentially. So, this question of Sufism and Christianity is my question. It's my existential living question, and it's not something that I think that I'm going to be able to provide a simple, instant answer. I don't think there are answers like that, but it is my question, and I'm willing to explore this question because I think it is our question, the question of each one of us who is here. So let me begin with a piece of writing, because this is the clearest understanding of the difficulties, thank you, we face between Christianity and Islam. In the writings of Frithjof Schuon, I want to quote, not from his book Christianity, Islam, which is wonderful in itself, but from a long article entitled The Human Margin. I quote now a rather lengthy passage. I don't know if I'll quote the whole thing, because I feel that this passage expresses the full gravity of the difficulties we are actually facing in this dialogue, difficulties that we should not sweep under the rug. Whether or not one accepts Schuon's characteristic solution of an intellectual alchemy transforming the lead of a rigidly excessive volative theology into the metaphysical gold of a transcendently unitive metaphysic at the heart of all religions. Nevertheless, he had, to an extremely high degree, an intuitive understanding of both faiths. One of the great difficulties, I quote, of Sufism is that in it the highest metaphysics finds itself inextricably bound up with theology, which tarnishes it by its habitual confusions with regard to omnipotence, unless we admit that in this case, it is the metaphysical penetration that deepens the theology by eventually inculcating into it some liberating gleams of light. Now, Schuon used to compare theology to metaphysic in a negative way, or see theology as a step toward metaphysic, and had a different view of metaphysic than you find in most philosophy departments. But in later works, he also indicated that the term theology could be used in a higher sense, and that is the sense in which the early Hesychast fathers that I'm going to speak of use it. The theologies, by taking upon themselves the contradiction of being sentimental metaphysics, are condemned to the squaring of the circle. They are ignorant of the differentiation of things into aspects and standpoints, and they work in consequence on the basis of an arbitrary rigid data, the antinomies of which can be solved only beyond this artificial rigidity. In Christianity, there is the will to admit a differentiation in the divine oneness, and the equally imperious will not to admit, practically speaking, that there is any differentiation at all, the hypostases being merely relationships. As if the three dimensions of space were to be willed into one dimension only. In Islam, an obstinate unitarism comes into collision with the existence of the world, whereas there would be no conflict if the unitarism were metaphysical and therefore transparent and supple as its nature demands. The metaphysical transparency of things, a term used by Shua that I think is applicable in all contexts. It's something that we should seek for. The metaphysical transparency of things. It is a gift. It is a consciousness. It's not an abstract piece of language. And that's what he's speaking of here. That this is how the unitarism of Islam is overcome. And he also feels this is how the extreme Trinitarianism of Christianity might be overcome. On the one side, there is a certain dispersion in the object of worship. God, the persons, Christ, the Eucharist, the Sacred Heart. On the other side, there is, on the contrary, an excess of centralization on a plane where it cannot possibly be imposed, namely, a refusal to admit any cause except God, or to be dependent on anything but on Him alone, thus flying in the face of immediate evidence. When in reality, such evidence in no sense prevents everything from depending upon God, and when one only needs to be conscious of this, to be on the side of truth. From the standpoint of an extreme Trinitarianism, God is certainly one, but He is only so while being three. And there is no one God except in and by the Trinity. The God who is one without Trinity, or independently of all hypostatic deployment, is not the true God, for without this deployment, unity is meaningless. So Frithjof Shua. I think the notion of a human margin is essential and crucial for our deliberations, and especially for the dialogic partners for this weekend. It is also important to be as clear-minded as possible, as I said, about the problems that we face in this dialogue because of the human margin. For example, what Schuon calls extreme Trinitarianism, which I just read, is actually characteristic of each and every one of the early Hesychast fathers with whom we will be exploring the practice of the remembrance of God. Yet in my reading of the greatest of them, saints such as Dionysius, the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, or John of Damascus, who, if you recall, lived under the rule of Islam and knew it well intimately from the inside. Their insistence upon an expression of divine unity seems in no way inferior to the most radical of the unitarists of Islam. Nor does one see in their writings, and it would be easy to supply dozens of texts showing this, the slightest indication that they are guilty of that greatest of Islamic sins against God, association, or shirk. The remembrance of God is central to the practice of both Sufism and Hesychasm. If the God we are seeking to remember, and here is the question, is the same God, and if we are all sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, as C.S. Lewis would put it in his Narnia books, and if human nature is a unity, as both Trinities assert, then human beings who are Muslims cannot have a different kind of heart from those who are Christian. Or can they? Cannot have a different kind of heart, because the same God created the same human nature in the same way. So the heart, at least, if the doctrine isn't, the heart, at least, we are speaking of, has to be the same heart. How then does the way Hesychasts seek to remember God differ from that of Sufis? And how different is the path to the heart in the two traditions? Is it possible, given the unity of human nature, that in spite of doctrinal differences, the spiritual pioneers in the two traditions broke out of the human margin to find the same way home to the divine center? If that is the case, then how does the Christian insistence upon God one and three and the Islamic insistence on the unicity and, if I may, unshirkability of the deity remain ultimately relevant? You see, I'm not shirking my responsibilities here. It is not my purpose this morning, however, to explore these problems in my own talk in any depth, dialogically. It is important, though, to recognize, however, that these problems exist, and that the human margin where these apparently insoluble problems exist, must, in the nature of things, be our inevitable starting point. It is also the inevitable and very existential starting point of every person who turns to God in prayer. And true prayer, as the saints bear witness, will always lift us on noetic wings up from the human margin to the divine center. Okay, now it's time for... The subject of my talk this morning is presence, participation, performance. The remembrance of God in the early Hesychast fathers. Since Dr. Louth's subject was to be Evagrios on prayer, I think you will find as we proceed that Evagrios will have something to say about our subject and must be counted as an early Hesychast father, despite his adherence to a speculative, originistic cosmology which the Orthodox tradition later rejected. Himself a disciple of one of the greatest of the Desert Fathers, St. Macarius of Alexandria, or as known in the desert literature, Macarius the City Man, and an acquaintance of another towering spiritual master, St. Macarius of Alexandria, that's Macarius of the Desert, and possessed to an exceptional degree of the gifts of psychological insight and penetrating analysis. Evagrius was steeped in the spirituality of the desert in its highest and purest form, and almost single-handedly set the standard and devised the theory and technical vocabulary of Hesychasm. Many of the greatest Hesychasts, including in particular those from whom we will be hearing this morning, such as St. Diaticos of Photiki, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Isaac the Syrian, and St. John Climacus, follow this practical side of Evagrius while avoiding his dicier speculations, and develop even further the profound spiritual psychology to which he first gave definite, even definitive expression. As the first presenter on the Christian side of the dialogue, then, it falls upon me to begin with a definition of hesychia and hesychasm. For a working definition, we can do no better than to use the definition found in Volume 1 of the English translation of the Greek Philokalia, the work of G.E.H. Palmer, my friend Philip Sherard, and one of this conference's keynote speaker, Bishop Callistos, where hesychia is stillness, a state of inner tranquility or mental quietude and concentration, which arises in conjunction with and is deepened by the practice of pure prayer and the guarding of the heart and intellect. Not simply silence, but an attitude of listening to God and of openness toward Him. From hesychia are derived the words hesychasm and hesychast, used to denote the whole spiritual tradition represented in the Philokalia, as well as the person who practices the spiritual path it delineates. Parenthetically, in an informal poll that I conducted before I came out here, I found that although neither Sufism nor Hesychasm are exactly household words in America, people in California, at least, tended to recognize the word Sufism far more readily than the word Hesychasm. Now that may say something about California, but Hesychasm is catching up. if one goes by the number of hits one gets from a computer search. Nevertheless, virtually all the hits disgorged by the various search engines are actually misses if we as indeed we should, want to go by what the great Hesychasts themselves have to say about Hezekiah. Since my focus this morning is on the remembrance of God in the early Hesychast fathers, we will attempt to understand how those early Hesychasts understood the concept of Hezekiah. To begin, though, let us first determine who the early Hesychast fathers actually are. Hesychasm, according to Bishop Ware's definition, I just quoted above, is the whole spiritual tradition represented in the Philokalia. The Philokalia, as you know or may know, is a collection of texts written between the 4th and the 15th centuries by the spiritual masters of the Orthodox Christian East. It was first compiled in its present form in the 18th century by two Greek monks, St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite, that is, of the holy mountain of Athos, 1749 to 1809, and St. Macarius of Corinth, who died in 1805. Also in the 18th century, by what seems to be a remarkable kind of spiritual synchronicity, a Russian monk, Paisius Velichkovsky, who died in 1794, who had visited Mount Athos, seeking for the inner power of his tradition, and later settled in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, translated a selection of these texts into Slavonic. These translations were later translated into Russian and had an enormous effect upon Russian culture. I must point out here that neither St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain nor St. Paisius Velichkovsky were translators and were primarily concerned with texts and contexts. They were first and foremost monks. They were Hesychasts, totally dedicated to the way of Hezekiah. During his lifetime and after his death, the disciples of Paisius traveled throughout Russia and Romania like a spiritual wildfire, and America even. They got to Alaska, founding new monasteries and renewing those that were moribund. And these translations were done under conditions that are difficult, almost beyond our imagination in the age of computers and fax machines and copiers that seem to have a certain amount of intelligence of their own. The difficulty that Paisius experienced in writing in his own hand by candlelight in a cell on a mountain in Romania, certain texts of St. Isaac the Syrian, were themselves goads for him to transform his life in such a way that he was able to communicate through the remembrance of God that he had within himself. He was able to actually communicate that to other people in such a living, fiery, dynamic way that they in turn were able to carry that gift like a holy flame to others and hand it on. Not just the words, not just the practice even exterior, but that living flame, that eternal flame, handing it on in such a way that others handed it on to others and literally created a kind of golden age of spirituality in Russia and Romania that the waves of which we are still experiencing to this day. Perhaps the impact he had on Russia is perhaps comparable only to the impact of St. Gregory of Sinai, the great St. Gregory, died in 1346, who is credited with inaugurating in the 14th century a spiritual renewal in the monasteries of Mount Athos. And through his travels in the region from Sinai to Bulgaria, among the ascetics and the monasteries of the inner Byzantine world. Who then are these early Hesychast fathers? Volume 1 of the Greek Philokalia in English lists the following. St. Isaiah the Solitary, died around 489, 490. Evagrios, we already mentioned, died 399. John Cassian, died 435. St. Mark the Ascetic, also known as more appropriately Mark the Monk or Mark the Hermit, died in the 5th century. St. Theodicus of Photiki, 486. St. John of Carpathos, 7th century. To this may be added the names appearing in volume 2, including St. Theodoros, the great ascetic, St. Maximus, the confessor, St. Thalassios, the Libyan, St. John of Damascus, Abba Philemon, and St. Theognosos, 8th, 9th century. In the book, The Early Fathers of the Philokalia, which is a compilation of the Russian Philokalia of Theophan the Recluse, besides those names listed, we find also the writings of Abba Dorotheus of Gaza and St. Isaac the Syrian, died around 680, two of the most eminent of early hesychasts, to which we should add St. Barsanuphios and John the Prophet, whose letters of spiritual direction are a complete compendium of the spiritual psychology of hesychastic ascesis. The great John Climacus of the latter 7th century, and possibly ending with St. Simeon the New Theologian and his biographer in Hesychast, Nikitas Stiphatos, 11th century. There was, of course, another Gregory, who also spent 20 years on Mount Athos, almost the exact contemporary of St. Gregory of Sinai, who provided the Orthodox East with the definitive theological, epistemological, and ascetical methodological justification for hesychasm. I refer, as you know, to St. Gregory Palamas, 1296 to 1359. Both Gregories flourished at the high point of the 14th century hesychast revival and must therefore be counted upon the greatest of the later hesychast fathers. The famous hesychast controversy, or controversy, as our beloved Bishop Callistos will pronounce it probably more accurately than I, which took place during the 1330s and 40s, and in which St. Gregory Palamas took such a decisive part, produced a wonderful fruit that sheds light on the continuity of the hesychast tradition. In particular, it tells us whom the later hesychasts called upon as authorities in a time of severe crisis. Before the councils of 341, 346, and 351, one affirmed the ontological and existential reality of God's uncreated energies. Two, confirmed the experiential reality of the spiritual methods developed, or perhaps better, discovered by generations of hesychasts to be effective toward the acquisition of the grace of deification. And three, produced the definitive victory of hesychasm as a way of life, although I guess that's certainly being debated even yet. St. Gregory in 1340 drafted a statement known popularly as the Hagioritic Tome, and officially as the Declaration of the Holy Mountain in defense of those who practice a life of stillness. The document was signed by 20 of the chief elders and spiritual fathers of Mount Athos, and also by the local hierarch, the Bishop of Hyrsos in Chalkidiki, written in the heat of hesychasm's battle for its very life. The Hagioritic Tome takes a strong polemical stand for, 1, the complete reality of the uncreated, ungenerated, deifying grace of God. 2, that perfect union with God is possible in this life, both in the body as well as in the soul and spirit. 3, that the grace of deification is infinitely above nature, virtue, and knowledge. 4, that the intellect, or nous, seated in the heart, is the very organ of revelation for the human microcosm. 5, that the light of transfiguration on Mount Tabor and the light experienced by the hesychasts is one and the same, and that this light is, and I quote, ineffable, uncreated, eternal, timeless, unapproachable, boundless, infinite, limitless, archetypal, and unchanging beauty, the glory of God, the glory of Christ, and the glory of the Spirit, unquote. And 6, that just as the essence of God is uncreated, so are the eternal divine energies. And 7, that spiritual dispositions are stamped on the body. Now listen to this. That spiritual dispositions are stamped upon the body as a result of the gifts of the Spirit. That dispassion, or apatheia, is thus the key to deification, and thus, as a result, the possibility of enjoying an embodied life of incorruption in the age to come requires equally the possibility of the body's participation in the gifts of deification in this life as well. These principles the tome calls the doctrine of the saints, which is taught by the Scriptures, received by our fathers, and we have come to know them from our own small experience. Who are then these saints who most authoritatively taught this hesychastic doctrine according to the Hagioritic tome? In order of appearance, although not necessarily in order of importance, in the tome they are Dionysius the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, Macarius of the Macarian Homilies, Athanasius the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, John of Damascus, Diadochus of Photiki, and Gregory of Nazianzus, also known as a theologian. None of them is later than the 8th century. All are undisputed doctrinal and spiritual fathers. All are understood by the later Hesychast fathers to be entirely grounded in the experiential realization of the mysteries of the Spirit and entirely reliable sources of the uses and methods of hesychasm. So, let us now approach these early Hesychast fathers with reverence and interrogate them on the proper approach to the remembrance of God according to the way of Hezekiah. In a way, the difficulty of trying to communicate this without oneself being a hesychast and speaking from deep hesychastic experience is that the great masters of spirituality, and in particular these hesychasts, and I'm sure the same is true of the great masters of Sufism, use words that we're all familiar with, but they may use them in a way that totally bypasses the ordinary understanding, our ordinary understanding. We're going to be hearing words from them in texts because we're in a way bound by texts. But it's important for us who are striving to understand what they mean by the remembrance of God, or what they mean by the nous, or the intellect. It's important for us to understand that someone who is devoted in his entire life, someone who lives in the spirit of Hezekiah, may use a word that we know, but in a way that we do not, and with a consciousness that we do not possess yet or now, though we could. That we must always bear in mind as we look at these writings, because Hesychasm can only be transmitted not by a text, but by a kind of ineffable flame that passes from one to another and passes into the heart and strikes fire within and illuminates things that you didn't know were there, not all of which you want to see. But anyway, bear that in mind. When they use the word intellect, for example, which is the way that Bishop Callistos and the translators of the Philokalia translate the Greek word nous, we have to realize that that word intellect is not to be understood the way we tend to understand it today. It is not the reasoning power. It's not thinking in that way. It is actually a word that means, it's an ancient use of the word intellect, the way perhaps Thomas Aquinas in the West and in the East used the word intellect as opposed to reason. It is a kind of direct, intuitive seeing with the mind. It's a seeing. And even when I say with the mind, immediately I can hear in myself. I'm not blaming you for this. I can hear it in myself. I just said in the mind, and that means not real. That means epiphenomenal, not really phenomenal. But the reason I chose the remembrance of God as a topic is because I'm convinced that Hesychia or Sufism can only be transmitted if you are talking about and trying to deal with something that is experiential, that is phenomenological, that is something that is not just a text. And that's what the remembrance of God is in their thinking. So when we say mind or intellect, I'm going to probably use the word nous more often. But essentially I mean that direct, intuitive penetration to something that is darkened in most of us, most of the time. But we may experience it now and then. We may not even know that it is the nous. In some texts, there's an indication that this thing that is darkened in us, this nous, is actually uncreated, which is almost a heresy in the Christian tradition. And St. Gregory Palamas does say that the path of hesychasm, Hesychia, is to become uncreated. So that's what we're talking about. Anyway, little aside. That's not an aside. Now, one of the points made by the early Hesychasts over and over is that the remembrance of God cannot be achieved without the practice of Hesychia, without silence, without stillness. And even the word tranquility, I don't want to use, the tranquility does seem to describe it, but it's not tranquility. It's not cruising down the river. It's not that on a Sunday afternoon. And as a matter of fact, when the Hesychasts speak about it, they get rather vehement. They use violent language to talk about tranquility, talk about hesychasm. So obviously, it's important to them. And we're talking about something a lot more than just quietude. We're talking about a kind of receptivity that is so active, that is beyond the power of our greatest imagination of what activity is. Okay. That Hesychia, then, cannot be achieved without the practice of the invocation of the prayer of Jesus. We can see the indispensable relationship of Hesychia to the remembrance of God in the work of Nikita Stefatos, who is the biographer of the great Simeon the New Theologian, and the Hesychast in his own right. In his 100 chapters on the inner nature of things and on the purification of the nous, he gives the most complete definition of Hesychia to be found in the Philokalia. He writes, "Stillness is an undisturbed state of the nous, the calm of a free and joyful soul, the tranquil, unwavering stability of the heart in God, the contemplation of light, the knowledge of the mysteries of God, consciousness of wisdom by virtue of a pure mind, the abyss of divine intellections, the abyss of divine intellections, the rapture of the intellect, the rapture of the nous, intercourse with God, an unsleeping watchfulness, nepsis, spiritual prayer, noetic prayer, spiritual prayer translated as noetic, noesis, untroubled repose in the midst of great hardship, and finally, solidarity and union with God." Notice that the whole spiritual tradition of the Philokalia is summed up in this definition of Hesychia. In these words of Nikita Stefatos, and Stefatos means the courageous, we may also discern the lineaments of three dimensions or aspects or moments in the experience of the remembrance of God, which are simultaneous and paradoxical because they approach the very boundary of the gulf between the created and the uncreated. And it's that gulf that the great Hesychastic fathers always have in mind. And that's why they call it a miracle and a gift, because the gulf is somehow bridged. These may be referred to as approaching the divine presence, the mystery of participation in God, participation being a mystery. There's another one of those words that is, we think we know what it means. The fathers use it. Thomas Aquinas uses it hundreds of times. Dionysius is always using it. but participation. What does that really mean when we're speaking about the divine? And third, performance, or the paradox of the performance of agape, or the synergy between God and man. In other words, we are talking in the remembrance of God about approaching the unapproachable, knowing the unknowable, thinking the unthinkable, the created becoming uncreated. These three dimensions of remembering God are each governed by its respective principle: apophasis, apatheia, and agape. The presence of God is governed by the apophatic principle, which declares the unknowability of God in his own essence. Participation in God is governed by the principle of apatheia, or dispassion. Because without dispassion, which is the transfiguration of the soul's powers, there can be no participation in the divine energies. The synergy between the divine and the human requires a certain performance, which the Hesychasts call agape, or sometimes even eros when they're being extremely bold. A suffering of the divine in a personal act of love, both on God's part and on ours. These three governing principles, apophasis, apatheia, agape, are insisted upon by the Hesychast tradition because the spirituality of the fathers of the Philokalia is grounded in the inescapable fact of the infinite gulf between the created and the uncreated, and the paradoxical experience, not the abstract expression, but the practical experience of simultaneously bridging the unbridgeable gulf while acknowledging its eternal reality. And I believe that that the reason they're extreme Trinitarians is because of this unbridgeable gulf. And I hope to be able to wind this up with that insight at the end. So, root for me. The act of the remembrance of God, if it is genuine, that is, if it is grounded in Hesychia, is a paradox, walking on the invisible waters of an infinite abyss. On the one hand, the Hesychast tradition insists on the radical unknowability of God. We can know that God is, the saints insist, but we cannot know what God is. On the other hand, the Hesychasts insist equally strongly, as we have seen in the Hagioritic Tome, on gnosis, or gnosis, as our beloved bishop will pronounce it. The real experience of God in the heart. It is a kind of knowing through unknown, knowing the unknowable through an unknowing knowledge. St. Maximus the Confessor expresses this paradox thusly, piling negative expression upon negative expression. A perfect intellect, nous, is one which by true faith and in a manner beyond all unknowing supremely knows the supremely unknowable, and which in surveying the entirety of God's creation has received from God an all-embracing knowledge of the providence and judgment which governs it. Insofar, of course, as all this is possible for man. Now that insofar, that comes, I always get a little suspicious when Maximus does this, because it seems like he's opening a door, perhaps, a way out. Insofar as this is possible for man. But he's not, actually. What he is saying is, this is it. This is a statement the way it is. But it's possible for man insofar as he dedicates himself, insofar as he practices Hesychia, insofar as he is willing to give blood so that he can receive the Spirit, insofar as he is willing, literally, to put his life on the line. It's in that sense. In the same work, that was from Centuries on Charity 399. In the same work, now Century on Charity 100, when the intellect nous is established in God, it at first ardently longs to discover the principles of his essence. But God's inmost nature does not admit of such investigation, which is indeed beyond the capacity of everything created. The qualities that appertain to his nature, however, are accessible to the intellect's longing. They are accessible to the intellect's longing. I mean the qualities of eternity, infinity, indeterminateness, goodness, wisdom, and the power of creating, preserving, and judging creatures. Yet of this, only infinity may be grasped fully. And the very nature of knowing nothing is knowledge surpassing the intellect, as the theologians Gregory of Nazianzus and Dionysius have said. Now there's a number of extremely strange statements in there. Among them is, of this only infinity may be grasped fully. I only realized he said that last night, about 2 a.m. And I've been reading this for 15 years. See, I got tired enough. My dianoetic reason was dead. And then I realized that he said, only infinity may be grasped fully. Now, if there's anything we know about infinity, it cannot be grasped fully, because it is infinite. There's always something beyond which you can grasp. So, what is he saying here? Well, this is this Hesychast paradoxicality that is so extremely important. But of all the attributes of God, he's saying infinity might be grasped fully. But fatherhood, sonship, Holy Spirithood, what about those? Then he says the key is that the key is a kind of ardent longing. The qualities, the essence of God is unknowable. The Hesychast fathers will insist on this. And here we are talking about remembering God. See, we're going to get to the point where we're saying, well, what in good God's name do they mean by remembering? If God is unknowable, what are we remembering? This is the question. But he says then that what is the qualities that appertain to the divine nature, that is, the divine uncreated energies, all that we can know about God, are accessible to what? To the intellect's longing, to the nous's eros. Clearly the word that Maximus is using there is eros. He's using it in all the power of desire and longing that he can possibly throw into that word. And it seems to me that that is the sense that we have to understand what the Hesychasts mean when they talk about the remembrance of God, or what you are setting out to do when you are seeking to remember God. Given the presuppositions of divine unknowability, as I was just talking about, and yet the human requirement to remember God, what does the remembrance of God mean, then, in the Hesychast tradition? Does it mean merely keeping the thought of God in the mind as much as one can? Does remembering of God mean a religious act of praying to God? If you say the name of God repeatedly with your voice or in your mind, is that what remembering of God means? Is it invocation itself? When you are saying the name of God, are you then in the act of remembering God? And when you are not saying the name of God, are you no longer in the presence of God? Because you have forgotten God. Above all, God being God, that is, the divine nature being what it is, infinite, unknowable, ineffable, does the word remember in the Hesychast injunction to remember God have the ordinary meaning to call back to memory what has been forgotten in the manner of recalling a feeling one used to feel, or better, a person one used to know? Or does it have a special technical meaning? It's this now that we want to explore. St. Mark the monk, the ascetic, as he is called in the Philokalia, in his work on those who think that they are made righteous by works, 226 texts, provides a definition of the remembrance of God that is so simple, so supple, and so perfect that it is well nigh inexhaustible. I have been reflecting on this passage for almost 20 years, and there is simply no end to it, no end to its truth. The remembrance of God is suffering of heart endured in a spirit of devotion. But he who forgets God is self-indulgent and insensitive. I repeat, the remembrance of God is suffering of heart, endured in a spirit of devotion. But he who forgets God is self-indulgent and insensitive. When we look closely at this passage, we notice that it is divided into two sections in a manner very similar to the book of Proverbs. Kind of a thesis and an antithesis. There is a thesis, a positive statement about what the remembrance of God consists, followed by its antithesis, a statement about forgetfulness of God. The thesis contains four elements: remembrance, suffering of heart, enduring, and a spirit of devotion. The statement of antithesis tells us that failing to remember God produces in the soul a state of self-indulgence and insensitivity, automatically, directly. The thesis statement is surprising when we really look at it. It's even counterintuitive. For in our ordinary understanding of things, or even in a religious attitude of piety, in the very best sense, we would expect to be told, wouldn't we, that the remembrance of God will make us happy. It'll make us reconciled with God, secure in his love, comforted by his presence. Instead, we are told that the remembrance of God is suffering of heart, which must be endured, even endured in a spirit of devotion. We tend to come to God expecting to be comforted and consoled and justified. The saint tells us that there is no remembrance of God without suffering of heart. And furthermore, strongly implies that our desire to God without suffering is actually self-indulgence and even insensitivity. One could even say it is sleep, because we are not remembering God at all. A later passage of St. Mark in the same work gives some indication of what he means by linking the remembrance of God with suffering of heart, and is in itself characteristic of the ascetical ethos of the Hesychasts. If you wish to remember God unceasingly, do not reject as undeserved what happens to you, but patiently accept it as your due. For patient acceptance of whatever happens kindles the remembrance of God, whereas refusal to accept weakens the spiritual purpose of the heart and so makes it forgetful. Like all the ascetics and true spiritual masters, St. Mark is highly attuned to discerning the effect upon the tone of the soul of various thoughts, practices, and activities. If there is no remembering of God without suffering of heart, then the avoidance of suffering, or resisting or refusing to accept the will of God in what happens to one, sets a tone of self-indulgence, weakens the spiritual purpose of the heart, makes the soul forgetful of God and concerned with itself, creating a condition of self-love as the dominant force in the soul, which produces the insensitivity referred to in the antithesis statement. St. John of the Ladder calls this state, this insensitivity, produced by self-love, stony insensibility. You're like a stone to the Hesychast. When you become insensitive, when you forget God, you become stony. You become like a stone. You become like a troll in the morning. Make a good title for a song. Maximus the Confessor calls self-love, philautia, the mother of all passions and vices. But why is the question? Why, one may ask, is the remembrance of God only approached through suffering? Why can't we approach God by remembering his blessings? His promises to the righteous, his great mercy and goodness. Is this emphasis upon suffering not an example of that flagellating anti-life attitude that Christianity is often accused of promoting, a kind of moral sickness of religion based on a notion of a vengeful, judging deity whom we must placate by our willingness to suffer. Some of the best works of Western literature are kind of rebelling against that attitude. I think of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I mean, he's extremely full of belief that somehow that's what Christianity is all about. And a book that was extremely important to me in my youth, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, is a wonderful example of a modern soul, in a way, discovering the joys of ordinary life, but the only way you can do that is by rejecting a kind of religiosity that seems to have created a judging God without providing a way to remember God. In answer, St. Mark might say, notice I didn't say physical sufferings are necessary to remember God. I said the remembrance of God is suffering of heart, and it is the heart, of course, that is the center of our discussion and of our understanding and of our contemplation this weekend. And not merely the heart suffering, but suffering of heart endured in a spirit of devotion. The focus of the remembrance of God is upon the heart as the center of man's being, and upon the combination of compunction, compassion, concentration, and contemplation that transforms the heart into a temple of God. In support of the suffering of heart endured with the spirit of devotion, that is the doorway to the remembrance of God, we turn now to one of the most profound of the early Hesychast fathers, St. Diaticus of Photiki, who lived in the 5th century. His work, entitled On Spiritual Knowledge and Discrimination, possesses a subtitle that reads, very informative, explaining what kind of spiritual knowledge we need in order to reach, under the Lord's guidance, the perfection which he has revealed, so that each of us may apply to himself the parable of deliverance and bring to fruition the seed which is the Logos. That's what spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, is in the Hesychast tradition. What kind of spiritual knowledge we need in order to reach, under the Lord's guidance, the perfection which he has revealed. We are called to be perfect, so that each of us may apply to himself the parable of deliverance, that is, the parable of deliverance, and bring to fruition the seed which is the Logos, the parable of the prodigal son, which is given in a great sermon by, I don't think it's translated into English, by Gregory Palamas, in which he interprets that in a hesychastic way. St. Diaticus writes, those who wish to live virtuously should not hanker after praise, be involved with too many people, keep going out, or abuse others, however much they deserve it, or talk excessively, even if they can speak well on every subject. Too much talk radically dissipates the intellect, not only making it lazy in spiritual work, but also handing it over to the demon of listlessness, akidia, or asidi, who first enervates it completely and then passes it on to the demons of dejection and anger. The intellect, therefore, should devote itself continually to keeping the holy commandments and to deep mindfulness of the Lord of glory. When the heart feels the arrows of the demons with such burning pain that the man under attack suffers as if they were real arrows, then the soul hates the passions violently, for it is just beginning to be purified. If it does not suffer greatly at the shamelessness of sin, it will not be able to rejoice fully at the blessings of righteousness. He who wishes to cleanse his heart should keep it continually aflame through practicing the remembrance of the Lord Jesus, making this his only study and ceaseless task. Those who desire to free themselves from their corruption ought to pray not merely from time to time, but at all times. They should give themselves always to prayer, keeping watch over their intellect even when outside the places of prayer. When someone is trying to purify gold and allows the fire of the furnace to die down even for a moment, the material which he is purifying will harden again. So too, a man who merely practices the remembrance of God from time to time loses through lack of continuity what he hopes to gain through the prayer. It is a mark of one who truly loves holiness that he continually burns up what is worldly in his heart through practicing the remembrance of God, so that little by little evil is consumed in the fire of this remembrance, and his soul completely recovers its natural brilliance with still greater glory. Thus Diadochus. So here we see what this is a kind of gloss on what suffering of heart means. The suffering of heart is really a case of breaking out from the bonds of our self-indulgence. And what the Hesychast fathers are asking us is not only who we are anthropologically, but they're really asking us over and over again to say, where am I? They use the question, where am I? In a deeply spiritual, a deeply metaphysical, a deeply real sense. If you say to yourself, where am I? And you really try to understand where you are right now, then suddenly something starts to happen. A beginning of something. A beginning of a kind of transformation in your consciousness. This is why, for example, all the Hesychast fathers, in particular the early ones, tie the remembrance of God to the Jesus prayer, but also to the remembrance of death. They say you cannot remember God without remembering death. Now why is that? What do they mean? Do they mean, well, you're supposed to kind of make yourself emotionally worried that you're going to die and go to hell? And yes, of course, there is some indication where they'll ask you to visualize the terrors of hell and the judgment and so on and so forth. But actually, they're speaking about something more than simply the visualization of torment. They're asking you and they're saying to you that you cannot remember God. What you will be remembering is an idol. Your thought of God. That's why the remembrance of God is not thinking about God sometime. It's not even thinking about God when you're in church. It's not even using the word God. Or as the Sufis and as the Hesychast might say, it's one of the levels. Maybe it's the first level of the remembrance of God. The beginning level. The level of the ordinary man. He must remember God by a word. But if it stays there, that memory becomes not a remembrance but an idol. It's a constant breaking of the idols. And death, or facing death, actually facing one's dissolution, is a breaking of the idols, a continuous breaking of the idols, in which then the remembrance of God can become real, and can lead from step to step, and from stage to stage, and from practice to practice, from the human margin to the divine center. Now, I had a lot more. I had 3 other papers that I wanted to read, but we can't do that now, so I will leave it at this point. God bless you.